SECfans.com, week 12, literally, not figuratively, literally the worst slate of the year. I hate to say this, but we're going to talk about the game of the week next, and that's Syracuse and Notre Dame. We could not find an SEC game that we really wanted to talk about this week, and it's going to be a shortened week because we are going live later this week, Wednesday, 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern. You guys need to subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, because we're going to talk live, and we're probably going to piss some UCF fans off in this video because we're doing an Alabama, Central Florida hypothetical. We are going to discuss Alabama and Central Florida, and there's going to be some negativity. Trigger warning for you UCF fans, some negativity, but it's only going to be factual. We're not going to be talking trash about your team. We actually have a lot of respect for your team, especially after what you did last year in your bowl game. But Central Florida fans, if you want to get at us in a live setting, you can do so Wednesday at 8 o'clock. Alabama fans, you know the drill. Let us know in the discussion below in the comment section what you think this game would play out to be. We're not going to do a score prediction because this is a hypothetical, and we don't generally do score predictions for hypotheticals. All right, Josh, Central Florida, Alabama, if they played today. We've got a computer model. We'll get into that model in a little bit. I'm going to kind of preload this with Alabama fans aren't going to love the model. So we're going to add some context before and after to discuss that. But first, let's talk about how hard it is. And Central Florida fans, I'm not making the comparison between these two teams, but we joke about how hard it would be to discuss Alabama versus an NFL team because the teams they play are so different. The schedules they play are so different. So when you do the statistical comparison, it would be hard to really judge how these teams would lay out on the field against one another. Obviously, we're not saying Alabama would beat an NFL team. We've been pretty consistent in saying that they would not. But Central Florida is one of those enigmas because we both think they're a good football team, but the competition they play is so bad. And that's no slight to UCF, and UCF fans do know we've said similar things about Alabama this year and Clemson this year, that you can still be a really good football team and play a horrible schedule because who's on your schedule is generally not your fault. So Josh, we're getting into the discussion of Central Florida and Alabama, and we want to evaluate these two teams in a hypothetical scenario if they played one another today. What's the first kind of step in terms of sort of bringing these two teams to an equal plane when you judge them? Talk about some of the challenges there are with the schedule and sort of what you can do in your mind in terms of like caveats and, tweaking the numbers here or there to bring these two teams to an equal assessment plane.
So the problem when you have teams in different conferences or teams that have pretty different schedules is really in trying to establish a baseline. And the analogy I use a lot of times is when you compare teams in conferences where none of the teams really play each other, not just whether a schedule is easy or hard, but when you play, you're looking at, say, Alabama in the SEC, UCF, the AAC, and that there's not much of any overlap between the teams they're playing. And more importantly, the teams UCF plays, with a couple exceptions, don't play the teams that Alabama played. So, your second order comparatives, how you did versus LSU can't really be properly compared to how a team would do against Memphis. That's the difficulty. And the analogy is a Polaroid of two mountain peaks, and it's like you saw two mountain peaks and sort of saw the top of it relative to the mountains in its own mountain range, and you said which one's taller. If one's a mountain peak in the Himalayas and one's a mountain peak in the Rockies, but all you see is the peak, it's really daggum hard to tell which one's actually higher, because Alabama may be a lot better than teams they played through the first 6 or 7 weeks of the year didn't really tell us a whole heck of a lot of anything because those teams weren't really good in general. Likewise, UCF is a lot better than the teams they've played, but it's hard to judge because we don't know whether or not those other teams are good. But as much as it's easy to say it's an easy schedule or it's a hard schedule, I think the important part to sort of take away from this to a certain degree is it's a completely different schedule, and it's a very minimally connected schedule. And what I mean by that is, it's one thing to say whether or not a team is good or bad, or whether or not you've played good opponents or bad opponents, but real difficulty in terms of evaluating a team comes in when it's almost like they could be playing in a different division of football, right? I mean, if you have two teams and all the opponents they play are completely separate, and there's no intermingling where the opponents even play each other, trying to evaluate between the two, it'd be like if you're trying to evaluate a team, playing in Division Two versus a team in Division One, because their stats, the Division Two team plays a bad schedule relative to a Division One team, but there's no way to even evaluate how the stats should or could translate, because the teams they play are so off. And it may be if you took Alabama and put them Division Two, they would demolish everybody, and it wouldn't necessarily mean that Alabama wasn't a great team just because the schedule was really bad. But trying to take those statistics and translate them become really difficult. And how do you get past that? I think you have to look at anything, not just common opponents, but maybe even third order opponents. So how has UCF's opponents sort of factored in? And that's hard because, the North Carolina game being canceled probably doesn't matter much this year, especially since it was week 3. UNC had all those players suspended due to Sneakergate.
But, and they're still terrible. So
yeah, and they're terrible on top of it. But there are a couple data points, maybe a little isolated. A big one would be Mizzou Memphis.
Yep.
So Memphis and S&P Plus is the toughest team UCF's played, and we're being critical here. Again, we've been pretty critical with Alabama, and I know some fans have gotten frustrated with us in the comments earlier in the year, but it was fair given the teams they played up until a few weeks ago, to say that it's hard to tell you what the stats mean for these teams. But with UCF, there's only 2 teams in the top 60 of S&P Plus that UCF has played. Those teams are Temple and Memphis. Neither one of those is a top 25 team in S&P Plus, but Memphis did play Missouri a few weeks ago. They played Missouri the week after they played UCF. You could call it a letdown game to a certain degree if you want, but Missouri drove them into the ground. I mean, Missouri had 646 yards of offense on Memphis. I mean, Memphis had a respectable 408, which was pretty good for what Missouri's been allowing, but 5.5 yards per attempt for Memphis, 4.7 yards per carry. And Memphis went off 11.7 yards per attempt, 6.8 yards per carry, basically did, kind of whatever the heck they wanted to with Memphis over the course of that game. And at a certain level, when that happens, when you see that kind of disparity, I think you have to take something from it, and you have to be careful not to sort of overextend your analysis from that. It is one game. It's something in isolation. It doesn't necessarily mean that Memphis is a horrible team relative to someone like Missouri. But the flip side to that is, with so few data points, you have to take a lot from it. And I think you have to be careful not to go the other way and say, well, it's just one game. It doesn't really matter. It's like, yeah, well, outside those 1 or 2 games, if you throw those away, then you have to throw everything away. You can't make any sort of honest comparison between teams and conferences. It is really troubling that Missouri had their best offensive production by about 2.5 yards per play. They had 8.97 yards per play, almost 9 yards per play against Memphis. They didn't cross 6.5 against anybody in SEC play. So, at some level, there has to be a pretty big difference in quality there.
Yeah, and the reason I like Memphis, and we're going to get into some other games as well when we talk about this, but the reason I like the Memphis data point is because not only did Mizzou blow them out, they had 48 points in the first half, just to kind of lay the groundwork here. They had 48 points in the first half, and UCF the week before had to fight tooth and nail to get 31 points at the end of the game. They had to claw back and win that game 31-30. That is troubling, but you also mentioned that it might have been a letdown game for Memphis. They got blown out by Tulane. They also lost to an absolutely horrible Navy team. So not only do we see this one data point in isolation, but we also see the other teams they beat. And Memphis, like a lot of these other teams on UCF's schedule, when you remove the UCF game, all the other pieces kind of work like they work throughout the rest of the year. Like we know ECU is terrible. Memphis handled business against ECU. Everybody's killing ECU. And that brings me to another point that I'd like for you to kind of talk about. We look at this game in isolation, and I think it is the best data point. But we also, if you look at the entire rest of their schedule, not counting South Carolina State, who is not even a good FCS team, the entirety of the rest of their schedule, only one team hasn't been beaten worse than UCF beat them. So if you take outside again, so take away Temple, because that's the game where Temple losing by 12, that was their biggest loss margin throughout the year. I will say though, they also lost to Villanova, and let's see, they lost to somebody else that was terrible. Hold on, I got it right here. Buffalo. So they lost to Buffalo, they lost to Villanova, they lost to BC by 10, they lost to UCF by 12. And that was at home. So taking the Temple game off the board, every other team that UCF has been beaten worse by another unranked team. So not only are the teams they're playing terrible, but when these teams don't play UCF and they go into other games against unranked teams, they're getting beaten worse than UCF beat them. And I know I'm saying a lot here, but what we always say is you can be an elite team and have a crappy schedule, but you need to handle business. And we know that Central Florida is trying to handle business to be on that playoff radar, and they're still not able to blow teams out as bad as other teams are doing it. And if it was one game here or there in isolation, kind of like last year where the Memphis game at the end of the year was the real one kind of data point, and then they handled most of the rest of their schedule. When you look at this stat, every other team losing by worse than UCF beat them, 2 unranked opponents, what does that tell you?
I think what that says fairly consistently is UCF probably is very, very good, but it's a sign that UCF is not probably far and away better than what other teams have already been playing, if that makes sense. They're not necessarily on a completely different level. Something our channel talks about a lot, and I don't know how many UCF fans will tune in, try to get past the SEC fans moniker. We're fans of the SEC. You know, we're not SEC homers. We call a lot of blowouts, and we have, I think, a ridiculous track record in those games when we call those blowouts. And it's because neither one of us, we don't try to subscribe to the idea that we need to tout every game as a close game to make both sides happy. But the other side is both of us, I think, going to every game being objective and saying, yeah, okay, this is, X team is really good. Mississippi State's really good. LSU is really good. But when LSU went in to play Alabama, it's like LSU can be really good and Alabama can be on a completely different tier than anyone LSU's played. And a lot of times in those, in Clemson games, we tend to cover big teams, Clemson and Georgia and Alabama the past few years, Oklahoma, if they had a defense. Teams go into those games and they have probably unrealistic expectations because they don't realize no one you've played and a lot of times nobody that you've played, even anyone they've played, is on the same caliber of the team you're about to play. And when you play somebody like a Georgia or an Alabama or a Clemson, a lot of times you get these ridiculous scores because, the team is just that good. And a lot of teams, their lowest scoring production in a given season will be to Alabama and Clemson. And the most points they give up in a game will be to Alabama and Clemson pretty frequently because those teams are better than anybody else is playing. The fact that UCF almost never, and as you said, never beats people worse than anybody else has beaten them, which is something Alabama and Clemson have done to several teams, both of them this year, I think is a very strong indication that UCF, as good as they are, is not necessarily on a completely different level than their own opponents right now, or that they're not on a different level than who their opponents have played. even in the conferences they are in, the ACC and the SEC, I think it's easy to say Central Florida would be very competitive in those conferences. And I think that's why Central Florida sort of maybe gets an unfair shake from a lot of people, and that's fair. A much more difficult question is, would they actually beat the playoff teams coming out of those conferences? Because it's easy to say, yeah, Central Florida would have a very good shot of beating Mississippi State, or ranked LSU. And anybody that doesn't think that probably is being unfair or hasn't really watched them. But Alabama shut out LSU and Mississippi State, beats them by 20 plus. And just because you can hang with those two teams in LSU and Mississippi State does not mean that Central Florida is on the same tier as Alabama or Clemson, such that they would be able to win a playoff.
And Central Florida fans are going to counter that and say, well, we beat Auburn last year, and that's why we claim our national championship. I think it's a little unfair, and this is where I feel like it's tough, because I feel like we're that big SEC bully, beating up on Central Florida. But if you want to be evaluated as a playoff contender, you got to put up with the scrutiny that we give all the other big boys, and we do it. We piss off all the SEC fans. We've pissed off Ohio State fans, Notre Dame fans, and you have this group that thinks we're objective, and then this other group that wants to, just because their team is so good, they don't want to hear anything about how they're bad or how they can be exposed or any of that. So I'm not picking on Central Florida. They put a target on their back when they claimed a national championship after beating Auburn, and this is the scrutiny I'm going to give now is the same type of scrutiny we give Alabama when they're undefeated, or we give Clemson when they're undefeated. You beat Auburn after Georgia demolished them. You beat them in the same stadium that Georgia demolished them. Georgia lost and Alabama lost to a healthy Auburn team with a Kerryon Johnson that was healthy, that could run on them. If you've seen anything with Auburn's offense this year, and if you saw anything with Auburn's offense last year, the second he got hurt, and if you follow Auburn, it's a little bit different because we follow Auburn. The second their running game went out the window because Kerryon Johnson was all their running game, it completely crumbled their entire offense. And we've seen this with Auburn year in and year out, where they have one piece that is the glue, and when that piece goes down with an injury, they're shot to hell. So you got a banged up Auburn that just got blown out by Georgia. You did not win the national championship, because if you're going to do transitive property thing, then we can also do that with Memphis this year, and then eliminate you altogether.
Yeah, and I don't want to come across too strong, right? Because I know there's a lot of UCF fans probably that haven't listened to our video. We try to build up our credibility slowly by making predictions and having at least a fair amount of accuracy to that. Hopefully some Alabama fans can chime in and sort of buttress the fact that we try to be pretty reasonable and we don't really pull punches for anyone. We pick Alabama to win a lot because, Alabama.
We're 100% against the spread this year, both of us in Alabama games.
Yeah, no, true. We pick them a lot because they generally win. And like you said, we've been 100% with it, which included, by the way, both of us picking Alabama not to cover the spread last week. I think if you want to talk about last year, I think one of the unfair things for UCF is UCF was really, really good last year.
Yeah,
really,
I think they were
really
a better
good.
team last year, don't you?
I do. And they're still very good this year. And don't get me wrong, I think they're still a very good team. They were a better team last year. And if they had a stronger argument for making the playoff, I think last season's would do it. It's not the offensive side of the ball, which has still been pretty strong. It's I think the defensive side of the ball was a little bit more athletic. Everybody follows Griffin, but in general, the defense moves sideline to sideline quite well. But, to your point, one of the difficulties for a team like UCF, when you want to make this argument for the playoff specifically, when we're making a comparison to Alabama, when you make that comparison to a playoff team, it's a completely different level of argument. And UCF beats Auburn 34-27. You already made the point about Kerryon Johnson, but I think the fair point to make is not that, yeah, Auburn beat Georgia in the regular season a few weeks ago with a healthy Kerryon Johnson. But like you said, Georgia just shut down Auburn in the SEC championship game, beat them 28-7. And that score really, in a lot of ways, that game wasn't even as close as the score. Georgia doubled up Auburn in yardage. Auburn only had 259 yards in that game in 2017. Even if you accept the fact that it wasn't a fluke, even if you say that UCF was a better team than Auburn, I think both of us said, and when we predicted the SEC championship game last year, we both noted we thought it would be a close game, and then we had the question of, well, what happens if Kerryon Johnson doesn't play or he's not healthy against Georgia? And both of our conclusions was that it would be a blowout, much like it was a close game, or they weren't very good against UCF. But a UCF team that beats Auburn by 7 without Kerryon Johnson would struggle to be competitive with Georgia in 2017. And Auburn did not go to the playoff because they weren't good enough to beat Georgia. And I know they were the first time when they were healthy, but the injured Auburn that UCF played was not good enough to go to the playoff. That's the bar you're trying to clear. And even beating Auburn, even being able to show you're at that level, to say that that UCF should have gone to the playoff in 2017, to say they would have won the playoff, quite frankly, they needed to beat Auburn by 2 or 3 touchdowns at a minimum, because Alabama, when healthy, struggled with Georgia, but obviously with Tua Tagovailoa, they came out and won that game. Oklahoma, I think more importantly, went blow for blow with Georgia in a 40-something to 40-something game. I don't know. You've got to be able to show you can stay with that, and it's a different tier. It's a different comparison. I know it's a harsh thing to say, but given the context that we're trying to do a model here of Alabama UCF, the question of how UCF would actually fare in the fare in a playoff, because they probably would be playing Alabama as a 4 seed if they were to get in. It's a little bit hard to envision how that would happen right now, but if they were to get in, they'd probably end up being the last seed. You don't have to beat, you're not just trying to beat the guy that couldn't win the SEC championship game, the guy that finished 3rd in the SEC. You got to beat the number 1 guy, and that's tremendously more difficult.
And I think the other question is, so you're talking about winning a playoff game. And on the flip side, I would say the resume to get into the playoffs to begin with. And we are so focused on wins and losses, and it's really unfair to both the teams that play a poor schedule and the teams that play a great schedule, because one, all schedules are not created equal. And that's why Central Florida wasn't in the playoffs last year. But looking at Central Florida this year, I do think if they were consistently dominant throughout their whole schedule, they'd be sitting around 6 right now. But my point has always been, if you don't play an average to good schedule, and you have a couple of games in that schedule where you struggle to beat a really bad team, if you had that off day against Memphis, assuming that was an off day for you, what happens when that off day is against an LSU or even a good team? If you have, or an average team, if you have to go 12 weeks and not have an off day, because if your off day is 31-30 to Memphis, then your off day is not beating Georgia, LSU, or Alabama. And then looking at ECU, with 3 minutes left in that game, it was 23-10. Navy, they beat them by 11 points. There's 4 pretty bad days in their schedule that they had the luxury of having because they had a crappy opponent on their schedule. But if Alabama had the same 3 or 4 bad off days, then they're dropping 2 games this year, and they're not in the playoffs, and they don't deserve to be in the playoffs. So that's another thing that I think kind of goes unnoticed. But I feel like this is getting into a beaten up on UCF sort of discussion, and I don't want it to be, because I respect that program. I love, and this is what Bear said a couple weeks ago on ESPN on Game Day. He said, look, all of this talk about being in the playoffs is overshadowing a really great accomplishment that they've had so far. And that's kind of where we are, where we like this program. They're fun to watch, and we root for them as well. But maybe on the positive side for Central Florida, let's see what the model says, because I'm curious what the model says, and let's just kind of go from there.
So our model, 30-second version for our listeners, if you haven't followed us before, our model is designed to be a neutral model where we kind of take our hands off the wheel a little bit. And it's based very heavily on opponent data. It looks at how you did against your opponent versus how your opponents have fared against everyone else. It projects production for your team offensively and defensively. And then based off all that, we also look at your past history, and the model builds a scoring model unique to your team that teaches itself based off your own production. It's all fairly simplistic. I'm not going to say that it's that simple, but at the end of the day, it's not, super complicated, sort of abstract mathematics. The first intermediate neutral statistic that this model generates is percentage of opponent averages allowed. So whatever your opponents generate offensively, how much as a percentage does your defense allow them to gain? So Alabama allows teams to gain 68% of their per carry averages and 79% of their yards per attempt averages. We look at per play models or per play statistics, not total yardage, because tempo is way too large of a factor. In a team like UCF is going to have very high total yardage on both sides because they run at tempo. A team like Navy will have very low total yardage on both sides because they slow down a game. If you have to do per play in the modern era of football because the total yardage statistics skew way too heavily with tempo. So 68% of the against the run, they've now dropped below 70%. So they're now in what I often say, you got to really get below 70% to be an elite run defense. They're at that mark. You need to be below 80% to be an elite pass defense. They're at that mark. Their defensive statistics have increased, as one would guess, the past few weeks, shutting out LSU and Mississippi State. They're playing on a little bit of a different level. I think it's interesting that UCF gives up 94% of opponent rushing averages and 97% of opponent passing averages. And I don't want, let's circle back on that and let's finish the model first. But the notable thing there is UCF is giving up 94% of what UCF's opponents average running the ball going in, and 97% of what UCF's opponents average passing the ball going in. And then based off that, we sort of projected against each team and what your own offensive production would be. Alabama, based off UCF statistics, Alabama would be projected to have about 5 yards a carry and over 11 yards per attempt. And that would come out to about 7.8 yards per play, given Alabama's tendencies, run, pass, and whatnot. UCF would average about 4 yards per carry, which is respectable, but certainly not their 6 yard per carry average. And then 7.2 yards per attempt, roughly. We say 6.5 yards per attempt, and about 4.5 yards per carry is what you need to be effective. So basically, the passing game would be fairly, pretty competently effective. The run game would be moving, but not moving it enough, but at about 5.4 yards per play. And then based off their own histories, that would project Alabama to score 46 points. UCF with that kind of production would be expected to score 36.
And that's the part where I said in the open that Alabama fans might not love it, but there's a little bit of nuance we got to give to this. And the big one for me, and you touched on it as well, and I'm sure you're going to add a little color to this, but the 94-97 for UCF is a little bit jarring. And like you said, when we ran down UCF's schedule, you said offensively they really haven't had a huge step back this year. But it looks like defensively, when you allow 94% of your opponent rush defense and 97% and you play basically all scrubs, that's bad. Because what we say is anytime you give these percentages allowed, you always say, well, look, if you're around 100%, that's bad because you got to assume that there's some scrubs thrown in there that would help you lower that average a little bit. Well, UCF, no offense to them, and again, not their fault, their schedule is entirely scrubs. So you need to see that in the 60s, in the 70s. So this is even worse than a regular Power 5 team that would be in the 100% range for both categories that we would say is really, 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 really bad.
Right. So
maybe you want to add a little color to
scrubs,
that.
And so there's hopefully a couple UCF fans didn't tune out when you said that. I think the point Daniel's making and the way to interpret this is that's based off what your opponent's average. So again, this is just a neutral statistic we generate in the middle of the model that I think is a pretty interesting and very useful window into the teams. And it's rather than talk about yard per carry allowed or yard per attempt allowed, it's a much better metric because it's directly opponent adjusted to talk about quality of the defense. Well, Alabama is allowing SEC teams, by and large, to get 68% of their rushing average. UCF is allowing AAC teams to get 94% of their averages. Now, those teams themselves, their averages are kind of, you would think when, say, Memphis, as an example, talking about how Memphis did against Missouri, Memphis didn't have a great day offensively, right, at 5.5 yards per attempt. So that actually drags the averages of all the teams UCF plays down artificially, because most of their average is due to playing within the conference. And when they've played a step up, they generally haven't met those averages. So those numbers aren't even as high as they should be. But the numbers you see, like if it's, for example, UConn averages 5.3 yards per carry. Do you really want to argue that UConn at 5.3 yards per carry is a significantly better rushing offense than LSU at 3.9? I think that's a hard sell. But even within that lens, talking about what those teams, UConn and out Florida Atlantic and Memphis, what they've been able to average within the AAC relative to AAC teams, UCF is not a very good defense at 94% of rush averages and 97% of passing averages. Now, I understand their scoring defense has been pretty solid, but again, I usually say 95% is what you should consider to be average, because so many teams, you play, by the way, we throw out FCS statistics entirely, but we normally are talking about the fact that, somebody plays a Florida Atlantic and they inflate their stats. So everybody, if you hold them to their average, everybody's stats are a little bit inflated. We kind of have the opposite problem here, that basically most of the statistics for the teams that UCF plays are probably pretty heavily inflated due to the weakness of all their schedules. And still UCF statistics are struggling to break 95%.
So you gave me a little slight hell about calling their teams all scrubs. And look, again, we're going to say it in the next video too, because Notre Dame's schedule hasn't been great. It's not their fault that they're all scrubs, but they are by definition. And this is how I know this to be the case. I'll ask you this question. And maybe you can expound on it a little bit. Looking at Central Florida's entire schedule, their whole schedule, if you swapped the Citadel with, and just to give everybody a little backstory on this, people outside of the SEC are killing the SEC for this weekend that they have right now, where it's their FCS weekend, their cupcake weekend that's right before rivalry week. And everybody's like, oh, you're playing a cupcake schedule and a G5 or an FCS cupcake in November. Replace the Citadel with literally any team on UCF's schedule, and would Alabama still catch hell for scheduling that team at this point in November?
I mean, outside this year, I don't know. I think some respect's given for Memphis or Temple. Respect's given for Navy for the sake that they're a service academy, though this year Navy is, what is Navy, 103rd in S&P Plus?
And I'm not talking about how they've been in the recent past, because Temple's recently been good. Not necessarily the name on the jersey, but Temple lost to Villanova and Buffalo.
Right, no, but I mean the rest, but to get to the rest of it, if we're talking about UConn or East Carolina or SMU, I don't think they get viewed any differently, or FAU. I don't know that changes the conversation much. And I don't know that it changes the conversation in large part because I don't think it would really matter to Alabama if they played the Citadel or they played one of those teams. Something I think is pretty notable is Alabama through the early part of the schedule. I mean, they weren't just winning those games. When Alabama had a weak schedule to start the year, it was complete and utter, demolition of anybody they played. And
they were dominating a Power 5 schedule way worse than Central Florida has dominated or beaten in AAC.
Right, before they hit really Missouri, which is one when Tua Tagovailoa, had to start playing with a sprained knee, and then two, that's also the point when Alabama played. Missouri, LSU, Mississippi State are all top 30 teams, and even Tennessee's playing off and on at that level. Alabama was averaging about 9 yards a play, and you start looking down the scores in that list. A&M is the only team that they failed to score 50 on to that point in the season. And having watched them, that doesn't even really do it justice. The Ole Miss game, so twice at that point in the season, they'd scored 42 in the first half. The Ole Miss game, they were on pace. I think they scored 28 in the first quarter or something like that. I mean, that's one of the few times watching a football game and I started doing the math. Alabama could have scored over 100, and that's a really darn tough thing to do in a football game. They could have done it. Alabama was completely capable of scoring over 100 points in Ole Miss. So, yeah, I mean, it's you don't want to penalize UCF too much for their schedule because they're doing the best job they can in front of it. But like you talked about those off games, those 2 to 4 off games, and the fact that they have a close game with Memphis. What's really concerning about it is when Alabama's played teams of this quality, and this year, weirdly, it makes the comparison maybe easier because they played like 6 of them. I mean, they're winning those games 55-3. So
right,
every time, and without ever being in doubt or close. So I mean, that's a problem. It's concerning, and it's something that doesn't necessarily bode well in sort of this hypothetical. And I'll throw one stat back myself, and that's I even think sometimes the advanced statistics have a hard time with this. And we've talked a lot this year back and forth. S&P Plus changed their internal metrics to rely more on in-season data. So they swing the results more this year. They're using preseason projections more, but they're also letting the model change, their internal models change. We reference S&P a lot because we need some way to rank teams from 1 to 130. By the way, 130 is UConn. But their numbers seem to be swinging pretty rapidly, and I think it's almost overreacting. And the first thing I'll say with that is I think they're letting teams make up too much ground in conference play. So when you play those 1 or 2 out-of-conference games and say you get shellacked, well, now you start doing pretty well in terms of your own conference. You do well within the AAC. Well, it's letting you climb too far up that ladder because you go undefeated in the AAC, even though you dropped a game or 2 early in the season. And I'm not really hitting on UCF. The team I'm actually looking at here is Memphis. So Memphis in S&P Plus is 28th. Memphis lost to Navy. They lost to Tulane by 16. They lost to UCF in a close game. Sure, they got destroyed by Mizzou by 32 points. I mean, their wins are over Mercer, Georgia State, South Alabama, UConn, East Carolina, and Tulsa. The Tulsa win is by far their best win of the season. And for them to be 28th, Iowa's 33rd. And is Iowa the greatest team on planet Earth? No. But do you really think Iowa would have lost 4 of those games?
Where's Missouri ranked?
That's a fair question. Where is Missouri ranked now? Missouri's 23rd. So I know until recently Memphis was ahead of Missouri, but even still, Memphis is 5 slots back from Missouri, who just 2 weeks ago doubled them up in a completely uncompetitive game.
So, again, I want to reiterate, we've been saying all year Alabama's schedule is bad. And we've been saying all year until the LSU game, they ain't played nobody, Paul. But we still could glean a lot from that. Look, Alabama gets 0 credit for beating Missouri. Like, I have not heard anything but Alabama's played trash teams all year, and that's after they beat Missouri 39-10 and shut it down in the third quarter when Tua got hurt. So if Alabama can't get credit for a 29-point win over a team that is doubled up better than UCF's best win, which was by 1 point, that's tough for me. But I will say this, if I'm going to, again, give a little credit to Central Florida, if Central Florida had dominated their schedule, let's say they had the one close game against Memphis, because it's kind of become a rivalry game, especially after last year with that crazy ender. If Central Florida had only the one slip up and the rest of the games were 4 touchdowns or more, just like Alabama against their schedule, would you have them ranked around 6 where Oklahoma, like I would have them ahead of Oklahoma. I'd have them at 6 right now. Would you have them around there too?
I think I would, or it would have to have it close. I mean, Oklahoma's pretty well dominated their schedule, right? I mean, Oklahoma, for, I know, they lose to Texas and then
Army.
Yeah, I mean, Oklahoma State. I mean, okay, yeah, you got a point. State. I mean, And this, I think, is the point you're trying to draw out, right? That Oklahoma, when they play Army, they had a close game, 28-21. But still UCLA 49-21, FAU 63-14, Baylor 66-33, TCU 52-27, Kansas State similarly. If they had beaten teams like that consistently or beaten everyone the way Alabama had, and to be fair to Central Florida, we're comparing them to Alabama. Not many teams this season really can compare to Alabama, nor historically can they. But if you look at Oklahoma, they haven't dominated week in and week out, not completely. Obviously, they've lost a game. If they stubbed their toe against Memphis, how much worse is that really than Oklahoma losing to Texas? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how good Texas really is. And
I think Army's not a terrible team, especially for a service academy team, and they do some weird stuff that shortens the game. But that game to me is no better than 31-30 Memphis. So if we're saying this, or at least I'm saying this to say I'm not past putting a G5 team in the playoffs. I don't think it's a ridiculous notion at all. And I don't think UCF making the playoffs is a ridiculous notion at all. I'm saying, for me, going into week 12, if Central Florida had absolutely dominated their crappy schedule, just like Alabama has dominated their mostly crappy schedule, I'd have them on the edge of being able to get in. And then if Michigan or Notre Dame loses, and then Georgia loses to Alabama in the SEC championship game, they're right there at number 4. So neither one of us, I'm maybe putting words in your mouth, and I'll let you, follow up. I don't think either one of us is saying I'd never put a G5 team in. I'm saying that this year, based on what they've done, I wouldn't put them in.
No, and I think that's fair. And part of the problem when you don't play big name opponents, people talk about proving yourself, and it's the opportunity to show how well you can do. Because the only data points we have for the best two teams they played are clearly Memphis and Temple. Memphis was a 1-point win, and they were trailing towards the end of the game. And they recovered a fumble to score in the fourth quarter to take the lead in that game. Temple was 52-40, and that was kind of a back and forth game early, but they got a lead and just sort of stuck with it. If you want to show that those were isolated data points, that maybe that was your bad game, you need a chance to beat the crap out of somebody that's a ranked team, to show that you're capable of doing that. Because right now, when you look at UCF's schedule, those are the two best data points we have for how well UCF would translate against a ranked P5 team. And I know something Herb Street said a lot is the old Boise State schedules. The reason for that is Boise State beat the crap out of their schedule the entire year when they were in the Doug Martin, Kellen Moore era. And, the ability to go play somebody in Oregon or a Michigan State and beat the crap out of that team, what that told you was, hey, this isn't a fluke, right? And, maybe we had a bad game against a weaker team, but we were still more than capable of beating a better team. That bad game is not our limit. The close win over Memphis and the close win over Temple, that's not the limit of how good we can be. And, you saw that last year with Central Florida beating Auburn, but I think something that's really important to understand is, Central Florida beat Auburn the same way that they beat Memphis. And that showed that the Memphis win was almost like a bad game for them. But there was no way to know that until the end of the year. So bringing up Boise is going to lead me into one other thing I should say, or we should mention at least a bit before we finish this. We haven't really talked about UCF as a team or Alabama. I do think UCF has a really interesting concept. They're a good team. They remind me a lot of Utah when Urban Meyer was there in terms of how much they go 4 or 5 wide spread and throw it around the field. The team they really remind me though is 2012 Texas A&M, with Johnny Manziel there, and that they're really good up tempo with an accurate passing game, and they sling the ball kind of all over the field with consistency. And it's really hard to deal with that because you're so spread out defensively that you can't really ever get numbers anywhere. And teams have a hard time keeping containment or keeping the edge. And then all of a sudden with all this space, you've got some people running free. And then you got a really mobile quarterback in Milton who's really accurate with the football. It could throw a lot like Johnny, he throws from ridiculous arm angles. I mean, I know he has like that Frisbee background and whatnot, but his ability to sling the ball with accuracy at all over the field, cross angle across the field, no matter where his body position is, makes it extremely difficult to defend because when you're that spread out, the defensive back can be on the inside hip, he can be on the outside shoulder. He can't be everywhere all at the same time. And if you can spread somebody out that much and then place the ball accurately on whatever shoulder you want or, whatever position you want, there's really no effective way to defend that other than generating a pass rush. And he's too mobile to get an effective pass rush. Something I always said about the Boise State teams back in the day, I felt like those teams, you had Pettis and Moore and Martin. Those teams had a lot of talent. In retrospect, they had a lot of NFL talent on them. They were really good teams. They could have played with anybody. I don't know if UCF's at that level. I don't know that they have the supporting talent that those teams had. They have a lot of speed at receiver. They've got, good players over the field. The running back situation is kind of interesting, I think, with UCF because you've got one back in McCray who I think's got to be the best back. And with, almost half as many carries as Killens, he's leading him in yardage. I mean, almost 9 yards per attempt for McCray. And a lot of that's because he's 5'10", 175. But when you spread people out that much, you can get away with it. I do think UCF would have a lot of success against a lot of different teams. I think the thing you would need to be able to do to UCF is you'd have to be able to really rush the passer and contain McKenzie so that he can't extend plays and get, when you roll outside the pocket, it also creates weird angles for the defense. It's hard to get between the receiver and the ball. So you need to pressure him so that the routes don't take too long. And then you got to be able to keep containment on the running backs, and you got to be able to keep pressure on the receivers. I think the only way you can defend UCF is by doing press man and then getting to the passer before guys reach you over the top. There's not a whole lot of teams in football that can actually do that. I think two teams that could would be Clemson and Alabama. I think Notre Dame probably could. I think Michigan probably could. So basically you're talking only the playoff teams. But, outside those teams, UCF would be a real challenge for anybody outside the very best teams in college football. I think, they have a very good shot of beating even a top 10 team with that offense. It's just when it's run this well and this effectively, it's extremely difficult to stop. And yeah, I mean, I do think, by the way, the last thing I'll say on this is I made the comparison to Boise. My statement with Boise years ago, and I said it then, and was Doug Martin to me was the bigger key to that team than Kellen Moore. Moore got all the hype. The receivers were really good, but to me, with that team, it was Doug Martin and the inability of people to actually stop the run game that made that what was actually a fairly conventional pro-style offense in a lot of ways work because people had to overcompensate for the run. Obviously, Martin's had a much better pro career than Kellen Moore. So I think it's fair in retrospect whether or not you believe that I said that then or not doesn't really matter. That the point is that Martin was the bigger key. I don't think UCF is that way, and that's kind of my concern. I do think it's a little too quarterback based, and as much as a great quarterback can make a team extremely difficult to defend, the teams from Group of Five that probably were the dominant ones. Boise's the example. They got that way because they had 5 or 6 guys on the team that were real NFL caliber talents as much as anybody else. I don't think UCF has that. I think they've got a really good quarterback and a good offense. But the reason they're staying with teams in their own division is because they can't out-athlete them in other ways if Melton's not on his game. And when you play teams at an elite level, they're going to key really heavily on McKenzie unless they can compensate. And I'm not sure they have the oomph to do that.
And you said something a little ways back about Central Florida being hurt by not having these P5 opponent data points to judge them against. And I think there's a fair argument and an unfair argument that a UCF fan is going to make and say, well, look, we've had weather events that have canceled the games 2 years in a row when we were undefeated. And nobody will play us. I think the second one isn't accurate. Now, I think Alabama or Clemson probably not scheduling UCF right now, but also, so one step back, the 2 games that were canceled for weather events, those games don't help you at all. North Carolina is absolutely terrible. If you beat North Carolina bad this year, just like you beat Pitt, Pitt's terrible. I know they're leading a division right now. Pitt lost 51-6 to Penn State. That's not a good football team. You need that middle tier kind of team that's not worried about maybe dropping a game to a ranked G5 team and missing a national championship game. More like an 8-9 win team they're on the edge of being ranked, but is good enough to show a data point that you were competitive or beat them. I will say, though, they have the return trip of the home and home that they started in 2015 with Stanford next year. So this will be an interesting data point next year. We haven't been high on Stanford, but it's a P5 program that's been ranked, that's won a lot of ball games. So we will have something starting next year to be able to judge on them. And it will be interesting. All right, don't give me a score, but if you had to just guess in terms of giving your fudge factor for the difference in quality and competition as we wind this one down, there's a 10-point spread in our computer model without picking the scores, but knowing that Central Florida would score on Alabama. They absolutely would. What do you think that final margin of victory would probably look like if these two teams play today?
It is the question if they play today or if they play theoretically into the season when they're healthy, which I think is an important question.
If they were healthy. If these two teams healthy both played their B game.
Right. So, and the reason I ask that is, we're recording this following the Mississippi State game, and Alabama is not remotely healthy offensively, which, again, is why neither one of us thought they'd cover the spread last week against Mississippi State. I think it would be worse than 10 points. Alabama, we kind of thought it early in the year. We thought it pretty quickly out of the gate on this channel, which is verifiable one way or the other. But they're almost historically good on both sides of the ball. And I think one of the most difficult things to say if, say, you're a UCF and you're undefeated this season is, and this goes back to what the Bear was saying on ESPN, this could be the best UCF team in UCF history, and they still could lose to Alabama by 3 touchdowns. Those things are not mutually exclusive because of how good Alabama is and how just incredibly rare it is for any team to ever get on that level. I think that's the reality for the hypothetical. I think it's interesting that Alabama would only be favored by 10 in our model. I caution a little bit. Our model struggles because UCF has not scored fewer than 31 points in a game. But UCF would be expected to have their worst game offensively of the season. Less yardage than they had against East Carolina. And that's even with all the relational data point problems we had. I think an more interesting question, if you're talking about how they would do, I think it could be interesting if UCF played like a Michigan or a Notre Dame, who hasn't been as dominant as Clemson or Alabama this year. I think it could be really interesting how UCF would do against certain teams. And I do think Michigan,
where the matchups are bad.
Yeah, and that's what we saw when Utah beat Alabama in 2008. I've always held that game was not a fluke. What happened is Alabama played in a conference where everybody played pro-style offenses, and Utah went 5 wide almost the entire game. Alabama was forced into dime sets, and they had to have 6 defensive backs in the field. And all of a sudden they had I think it was actually maybe a true freshman, Mark Barron, that had to step in at defensive back, and he didn't really know what he was doing, and they got torched because the secondary was having to play players that had never played. They didn't really have 6 defensive backs. It's not a package they ever ran. I think that's why, to a certain extent, Notre Dame, who at least plays in the ACC, has some more wide open offenses that'd be a little better. But I think Michigan in particular could go really wacky. Michigan might really struggle playing this style of offense that in the past few years, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Michigan's played a team that goes 5 wide to the extent that UCF does with tempo. I know there's a couple teams like Purdue and Indiana off and on have done it, but not in any way to this extent. UCF would have a better shot there. But Alabama, especially because they've played so much in the postseason, because so many SEC teams like Ole Miss have gone to this sort of wide open, aggressive approach. Alabama has actually built and recruited to stop this kind of offense since Johnny Manziel, especially. This would be a particularly difficult game for them to be able to win, even though I think UCF could win a game in the playoffs this year if they were in the playoffs against the right team. But the teams they would play would be Alabama or Clemson, and those teams are too deep athletically and would be able to get the matchups. It would just be very difficult.
All right, Al, that's our super long-winded discussion about a game that won't even happen. So there you have it. You asked for it, and we're nothing if not consistent in giving y'all what you asked for most of the time. I think it's an interesting game and an interesting discussion, and I hope UCF fans didn't take us as beating up on them too much, because we're really not. Like, we were pretty high on you last year. We liked your team a lot last year. We want you to be a little more dominant if you're going to have this easy of a schedule, and it is an easy schedule. It is an objectively easy schedule. It does not mean you're a bad team. I'm going to say 1,000 more times this year, especially when I'm talking about Notre Dame and Michigan and even Alabama. They've not had their normal schedule. The open with Louisville, that's terrible too. So this one got a little rambly, but that's okay. Remember, everybody, 8 p.m. Wednesday, we're going live this Wednesday. So get your questions ready, get your beer ready, get your hot tea ready. We're going to have a chat about football, and it's going to be fun. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless. Remember to subscribe.